Liam Lawson will officially be Max Verstappen's 5th teammate in his time at Red Bull Racing. And a lot of people are confused by the decision. Some people feel like this seat rightfully belonged to Yuki Tsunoda. Other people feel like Red Bull should have gone outside of their own camp and picked someone like a Valtteri Bottas, or even a newcomer like Franco Colapinto. And others still just feel like Liam Lawson really hasn't earned this contract yet. But what's most interesting about this decision to me is that it really signals that we are at the end of a dynastic era in Formula One. Dynasties are something that happen in every sport. In the NFL, think about like the New England Patriots, or in the NBA, think about the Lakers and the Celtics and how they were just trading championships back and forth. We have the same thing in Formula One, which are these periods where one or two teams go back and forth trading championships. And sometimes those periods last for a very long time. For a second, let's just go back in time. Every single championship since 2009, both drivers and constructors, has been won by either Red Bull or Mercedes. This year was the first year that that didn't happen. And McLaren obviously took that constructors championship, but Max still managed to take home the drivers championship. And if we look at the way that Mercedes in particular has been moving over the last few years, they knew that this change was coming. But both Red Bull and Mercedes were not prepared for this change to happen right now. So let's look at where this dynastic period started. In 2009, a team called Brawn GP won both the constructors and the drivers championship. The driver that won the championship was Jenson Button. Brawn GP has one of the most interesting stories in Formula One. The very short version of it is that Brawn GP was originally a team run by Honda. And at the end of the 2008 season, without very much warning, Honda announced that they were pulling out of Formula One entirely, which meant that hundreds of people were about to be unemployed in the middle of the 2008 financial crisis. And there was one person who desperately wanted to make sure that that didn't happen. His name was Ross Brawn, and he convinced Honda's management to allow him to buy the team in order to keep running for 2009. And they ran that team with little to no money. If you're really interested in the ins and outs of that story, there's a documentary hosted by Keanu Reeves. It's called Brawn: The Impossible Formula One Story. Or if you're interested in me covering that as well, feel free to let me know in the comment section of this video. The important part for the overall story of Formula One is that Brawn GP, as the underdog, managed to completely upset the balance of the Formula One grid. Jenson Button won 6 of the first 7 Grand Prix that season, and even though the other teams started to catch up developmentally, Brawn GP and Jenson Button pulled out those championships by the end of the season. And the reason why I include this in the beginning of this dynasty shift I'm talking about is that the engine supplier for that team was Mercedes, and at the end of the year they bought out the team, and Brawn GP became Mercedes as we know it today. And from 2010 up until this year, we have seen Red Bull and Mercedes essentially just hand back and forth the Constructors' Championship title. Right after the Brawn GP season, from 2010 to 2013, we see Sebastian Vettel lead Red Bull to 4 back-to-back championships. And starting in 2014, we of course saw that shift to Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton took 7 World Drivers titles, and that streak was only broken by his teammate Nico Rosberg. And then in 2021, we see that shift move over to Max Verstappen. Now, what's important to understand about all of that is that in dynasty eras, it's really easy to believe that this is going to last forever and to not think about what happens next. So as we've seen Mercedes start to fall and we've seen Red Bull take a downturn this season, what we're seeing in response to that, including this Liam Lawson decision, is the fact that these two teams and their management recognize that they put all of their eggs in one basket. And we're starting to see the consequences of that because both of these teams are losing major stars. Let's look at Mercedes first. You could definitely look at the shift that started when Niki Lauda passed, but if we just look at the driver pairings, a very important moment in Mercedes' move comes at the end of the 2021 season. Lewis Hamilton's teammate for years had been Valtteri Bottas, and he played a very important role in a number of Lewis's championships. Valtteri was a driver who was willing to be loyal to Mercedes, check his ego at the door, and understand that even if he wasn't winning the Drivers' Championship, he was on a Constructors' Championship winning team. This was a really important partnership, especially for Lewis Hamilton. But at the end of the 2021 season, after the very controversial ending that gives Max Verstappen his first championship, despite Lewis Hamilton saying that he wants Valtteri to remain his teammate, we see Valtteri dropped by Mercedes and replaced by George Russell. Now, this is a moment where we start to see Mercedes attempting to plan ahead for the next era. Because like I mentioned, when you're in these dynasty eras, it feels like it will never end. But it's the job of team management to think ahead. And what they were hoping at this point was that George Russell would be the future of the team. Knowing that Lewis Hamilton ultimately would want to retire, they tried to bring in the driver they believed would usher the future of Mercedes in early enough that he would actually be able to learn from Lewis Hamilton and that he would be able to hold the future of the team so that they didn't experience what Red Bull experienced when Sebastian Vettel left. The core problem, and this is where we shift from fact to my opinion, is that Lewis Hamilton was not thinking about retirement at that point, and bringing George Russell in went against exactly what Lewis had asked for. Lewis said, "I want Valtteri to be my teammate," and he feels that he deserves it. That loyalty was not rewarded, and it's this first crack in their relationship that we've seen play out this year. Again, this is the moment that we shifted from fact to my opinion, but I do feel like the writing is sort of on the wall there. Now, George Russell and Lewis Hamilton have been a driver pairing that has continued to deteriorate in their relationship up until this year. They have completely different driving styles, and you also have this issue where you have Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, who still believes he should be prioritized, prioritized, and George Russell, currently no-time world champion, who believes that he's the future of the team and should be prioritized. And instead of this relationship where you have the younger generation learning from the older generation, you have two people who still believe that they're at the top of their game, and there's no reason that either one of them believes they should be deferential to the other. And so then we get to Lewis's contract, the terms of which really caused, obviously, one of the biggest splashes in Formula One at the beginning of the season. From what we know about the contract negotiations, Lewis Hamilton wanted a 3-year commitment, as well as a position as a Mercedes ambassador after he retired. There are a number of other factors that may have been a part of this contract, but those are the things that we seem to understand. Lewis was not offered that. In fact, he was offered a 1-and-1 contract, which, if you're new to the world of Cargo Fast, basically means that you have 1 year guaranteed, and both parties, meaning the driver and the team, have the ability to opt out if they don't want to continue for the 2nd year. Now, that 1-and-1 contract term was because Mercedes wanted it. And that's not an opinion, that's something that Toto Wolff has been very clear about. Toto wanted the option for that seat to be available to Kimi Antonelli if he felt he was ready. Because it's very clear that George Russell hasn't proven to the team that he really will be able to replace Lewis Hamilton, as they continue to chase the partnerships that made them the dynasty that they were, being both Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. We're continuing to see that they can't get there. But in their scramble to try to figure this out, is it the 17-year-old wonder kid who drives faster than Sonic? Is it George Russell? What they ended up doing was ending their most successful partnership early, because as Lewis Hamilton saw the writing on the wall, he made a move to Ferrari. And I do think that there has been a narrative that George Russell was so much better than Lewis Hamilton this year, and that Lewis Hamilton is in some way washed up. But quite honestly, I think it's really because we're comparing him to the greatest run that he's ever had. And when we look at George Russell versus Lewis Hamilton, right? George Russell absolutely outqualified Lewis Hamilton this year, but Lewis Hamilton very much outraced George. We had so many situations where Lewis Hamilton and George Russell were on completely opposite sides of the grid, and by the end of the race, they were right next to each other. It's very clear that Lewis Hamilton still has championship drives left in him, but it was also clear to Lewis that Mercedes was trying to prepare for him to leave, and that they may have expected him to leave before he felt he was ready to do so. And so by trying to prepare for losing your dynasty driver, you kind of end your success early, and you see Lewis Hamilton go to another team like Ferrari. And ultimately, it's also pretty clear that Toto Wolff did not expect Lewis Hamilton to leave, at least not before Toto decided he was ready for Lewis to leave. And so when Lewis announced that he was leaving, it meant that they had to move up those plans to bring Kimi Antonelli into Formula One before he may necessarily be ready. Now, I do hope I'm wrong about that. I do think that Kimi has a lot of potential, but the question is, was the potential ready for next season, or would he have been better suited coming in 2026, or starting with a team like Williams and moving up to Mercedes after that? The answer is, it doesn't really matter. The what ifs really only would have come into play if Toto had been the one deciding when Lewis was leaving. And so with Mercedes, I think what you have is this overcorrection. It's an attempt to make sure we never lose again, and by doing so, we cut our winning streak a little early. Whether they were ready for it to be the case now or not, they have officially shifted into that rebuilding era, and we see that by how far they have fallen in the Constructors' Championships this year, and most likely we won't see them competing very well next year. So Mercedes ends their half of this dynastic era by simply being a little too eager for it not to end. Now let's look at the Red Bull situation, and especially the Liam Lawson announcement. Red Bull's fall was a lot more sudden than Mercedes, because we still have Max Verstappen at the beginning of this season absolutely dominating, and really seeming like it doesn't even matter who's in that second seat, he's gonna win. And he does still win the Drivers' Championship. But the Constructors obviously is a massive fall. The first big blow that Red Bull had this year was the announcement that Adrian Newey was leaving the team. Now, depending on how familiar you are with Formula One, you may not realize that Adrian Newey is the brains behind these rocket ships of cars that Red Bull has had. And he was a part of both of Red Bull's winning streaks, both the one that we had with Sebastian Vettel and the one that we just had with Max Verstappen. So Adrian leaving Red Bull is a massive blow that they weren't prepared for. And then you also have the fall of Checo Perez. Now, when we look at how many teammates Max has gone through, the real question does become, what kind of teammate does Max actually need? What kind of teammate would actually be a help to him? What kind of teammate would actually be a bond that works for him? Because if we go all the way back to his Toro Rosso days, which again, if you're new to Formula One, currently that team is called VCarb, Max's teammate was Carlos Sainz. By all accounts, that partnership between Max Verstappen and Carlos Sainz was a disaster. Behind the scenes, there were rumors of fights, and of course, a lot of fighting between dads. And Max's teammate, when he's promoted, is Daniel Ricciardo. The shift at that point becomes very clear. Red Bull believes Max Verstappen is the future of the team. Again, this is something very similar as to what's happening at Mercedes right now. The team was looking at the future, and they said Max Verstappen is the guy who's going to take us all the way. We are hanging our next dynastic hat on this guy, which meant that Daniel Ricciardo, who was a talented driver and a race winner, found himself playing second fiddle. And that was not something that he wanted to do. And so a driver pairing that could have been really great was broken up because Daniel Ricciardo decided to move on to what he believed would be better for himself. Daniel moves to Renault for 2 years, then to McLaren, ultimately is dropped, and as we know, eventually eventually made his way back to VCARB and then was replaced by Liam Lawson at the end of this season. But on the Max Verstappen side, let's look at how many teammates he's burned through since. Daniel Ricciardo leaves and is replaced by Pierre Gasly. Pierre Gasly being promoted gave Alex Albon a shot at the junior team, bringing a driver who we're now very familiar with to the grid for the first time. And when Pierre ultimately doesn't even make it through a whole season as Max Verstappen's teammate, we see Alex Albon get promoted into that Red Bull seat. And then ultimately he is dropped for Checo Perez, which is the first time that Red Bull looks to go to someone outside of their own team. At this point, they have failed to promote multiple junior drivers and they have lost a number of people in their own stable. And when you look at it, that was a time where it made sense for them to do that, because at this point they had already lost Carlos Sainz and Daniel Ricciardo. Pierre Gasly was at a point where we know he was looking for another team and ultimately did leave, and they had burned out Alex Albon, who ultimately goes and becomes the face of a team that's considered the junior team of their direct rival. So at this point, we see Red Bull desperately looking for a solution that can support Max, and Max driving at a capacity where it really seems like he doesn't need a teammate anyway. And that's why it becomes so easy to become focused on Max just by himself and not the future of your team. But then we look at the junior team and we see that while we have Checo up at Red Bull actually performing as a good teammate at that point, we bring in Nick de Vries to the junior team. And so quickly Red Bull drops him, and he is in fact replaced with Daniel Ricciardo, kind of bringing that cycle back. But when you look at it laid out that way, it makes sense that Red Bull would want to try to bring at least one person back into the fold. At this point, you had a number of promising drivers that ultimately left, and so you're continuing to just burn the bench. So yeah, they tried to bring Daniel back in. And then because it just seems like the man cannot catch a break, as soon as he gets that seat, he crashes and breaks his wrist. This is the moment where Red Bull starts to see a glimmer of hope, because reserve driver Liam Lawson takes over for Daniel Ricciardo. They see a driver who comes in at really high stakes, really high pressure, and not a lot of experience, and is able to perform at a very, very high level. But they only get a few races out of him before Daniel is ready to come back. And so now the question becomes, is it Daniel or is it Liam? And obviously no one wanted to see Daniel Ricciardo go. But at that point, I think is where we all should have realized that Red Bull is focused on the future. They're not just looking for a perfect teammate for Max. Max has been talking up and down about his plans to retire, about the fact that he does not intend to stay in Formula One forever, and that he's pretty happy with the championships that he's already won. He has no interest in chasing 8 championships, and he certainly has no interest in staying in Formula One forever. He wants to try other series, he wants to be a dad, he wants to have a family. He wants to stay up late and sim race without being criticized. All of that being the case, we now have to look at that second seat in a different way. It's now about who can support Max and also potentially be the future of our team. So that brings us to the decision that just came out. Checo Perez is out and Liam Lawson gets that second seat. And I've seen a lot of people say, why did we not get Yuki Tsunoda in that seat? And look, again, shifting from fact to opinion, I love Yuki Tsunoda. I think if you ask any one of my friends or most of the people who follow me online, it's very clear that I would have loved to see Yuki Tsunoda get promoted to Red Bull. But there are so many business factors that come into these decisions. And when we are talking about the future of this team, when we're talking about a team that's looking down the barrel of failure and currently entering a very weird rebuilding phase where they still have world champion Max Verstappen, and we see that even with all of the trouble from this year, he's still able to win a driver's championship. Red Bull is in a very unique position where if they make the right decision, they can not only get out of this rut that they're in from this year and hopefully be competitive again, they can start to build their future for when Max inevitably retires. Because here's the really big difference between planning for Max's retirement and planning for Lewis Hamilton's retirement. Max said he wants to retire. Lewis never did. So where Mercedes started planning and essentially tanked their own success and also created a team that will be one of their biggest pieces of competition next year, Max is telling Red Bull, I don't want to do this forever. You guys better figure something else out. And so that's what they're trying to do. Now, why does Yuki Tsunoda not fit into that future picture? There are a ton of factors, honestly, and we're never going to know all of them because it would be pretty bad business for these teams to just come out and tell you every fact that they know. But there are a couple that I think Red Bull has made very clear. If you watch Christian Horner talk about the fact that they made this decision, he says that it was very close between Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson, and that ultimately what they're looking at is future potential. When it comes to Liam, they feel that he has progressed so much faster than Yuki did. And while he only had 6 races as a full-time driver for VCARB, he was able to hold his own and progress very quickly, versus Yuki Tsunoda having 4 years with the team and not necessarily progressing as quickly if you were to extrapolate it out. Meaning that if you gave Liam 4 years in the VCARB seat, they believe his progress would outpace Yuki's. And second of all, something that we all know is coming, Honda is ending their partnership with Red Bull in 2026. And as much as we have seen people say that this shouldn't matter, that Yuki is free to leave Honda whenever he wants, and that Yuki himself considers himself a Red Bull driver, the fact of the matter is his introduction and connection to Red Bull started with Honda, and Honda is moving to Aston Martin in 2026. And there are a couple of statements made by both Honda and Yuki that make it clear that they would love to continue moving together. And I think if you had an open seat, you would have already known that that was coming. But the trouble over at Aston Martin is the fact that Fernando Alonso's contract goes through through 2026. And obviously Lance Stroll sort of has a contract that basically says you can stay till whenever you don't want to be here anymore. So the ideal situation is that honestly, when Honda moves to Aston Martin, Yuki would have moved with them. The trouble is just that there's not a seat right now. But it's also important to note that Red Bull is again planning for their future, and their future does not include Honda. So whether Honda views Yuki Tsunoda as a Honda driver, whether we view Yuki Tsunoda as a Honda driver, the only thing that really matters is what Red Bull views. And something that's very important in Formula One is the money and sponsors that you bring to the table. So when your main patron is leaving to go to another team, that's going to play a factor in you being the future of this team. Because let's look at it this way. Say Red Bull decides to promote Yuki Tsunoda. He only has 1 year left on his contract. So at the end of next season, Yuki is free to negotiate. He can stay where he is, and in this scenario, that would be as Max Verstappen's teammate, or he can negotiate to see if there's another seat available to him. And then again, in this theoretical situation, let's say that at the end of 25, he negotiates to stay 1 more year or a 1-and-1 contract with Red Bull. And then say at the end of 26, Fernando Alonso announces his retirement. Red Bull's now in a situation where Yuki can say, actually, I'm going to go to Aston Martin. I'm going to follow Honda, the company that has sponsored my career since 2016, the company that got me my break into Formula One, and the company that now has a seat open with the guy who designed the car for Red Bull in the first place, Adrian Newey. When it's your job to figure out what the future looks like, that's not a future you want to find yourself stuck in. Now, Liam Lawson, on the other hand, is pretty indebted and tied to Red Bull. So whether or not next season this is a great driver pairing, or if next season Red Bull just completely tanks it and falls off the face of the map, it's at least a year where they can start building towards the next version of their team. And Yuki unfortunately has too many factors that in the near future mean he may not be a part of this team. So again, shifting back to opinion, I always wanted that seat to go to Yuki. I really like Yuki, and I really think that as a driver, if he were given a top seat, he would really surprise everyone. But I also, from a business and sporting perspective, understand why they would choose Liam. Now, all of that being said, let's shift out of the fact and talk about opinion again. Maybe put a little conspiracy theorist hat on. Why would Honda publicly push for Yuki to get this Red Bull seat when it's highly likely that they already knew Liam Lawson had been confirmed? If you missed it, I will say Liam Lawson is not necessarily a press dream, and back when he replaced Daniel Ricciardo and now getting this seat, he's made it kind of clear that he knew before the Red Bull official line was. So when Red Bull basically said that they hadn't made a decision about getting rid of Danny, they didn't know the decision they were making until after that final race, Liam Lawson then came out and basically said that he knew for weeks. And then we have a kind of similar situation here where it seems like Liam has hinted that he knew around Qatar, which would have been obviously before they had announced that Checo wouldn't be in the seat and that Yuki was still in contention for it publicly. Honda pushed for Yuki to have a post-season test with Red Bull, and that test presumably and based on press seemed to go pretty well. But at that point, it also seems like the decision had already been made that Liam was taking that seat. And as I've been yapping about for God knows how long, I would say that I understand why they made that decision. Why put Yuki through all of the press? Why have Christian Horner say that it was so close? Why have Helmut Marko say some positive things about Yuki's test? And why have Yuki himself say that he felt that the setup and the car was really good for him? Again, we're wearing our conspiracy theory hats for this part of this conversation. We are speculating. This is not fact. This is just how I feel. And boy, do I have a lot of feelings about Yuki Tsunoda and his future. As I mentioned, Honda is moving to Aston Martin at the start of the 2026 season. And someone else who's moving to Aston Martin is a good old guy named Adrian Newey. Yuki's contract with Red Bull only goes through 2025. And I think this test was less about him getting this Red Bull seat and more about his future. And Yuki having a really positive show and really positive things said about his work in the Red Bull car is a conversation that Honda can now take to Aston Martin and try to pitch Yuki. Aston Martin has a very unique situation with the way that their seats are covered, and there's a hope from both Honda and Yuki that Yuki can eventually make the move over there. But the argument is partially that Yuki hasn't had any experience in a top-level car, so he can't show his true potential. This test gives him a slight ability to do that. Now, I'm sure there was an outside hope that he would be so great that Red Bull would say, we want to win more than anything, we're going to put Yuki in the seat. But the other hope is that Yuki can stay on the grid for 2026. And right now, the best possible place for him to do that would be to stay at VCARB, because if he can do so, he doesn't have to take a year off of Formula One, and then hopefully between 25 and 26, Honda and Aston Martin have a seat open. Maybe that's Fernando Alonso retiring at the end of his current contract, maybe that's Lance Stroll taking a step back from Formula One. Either option would open up a seat, and now Yuki has an extra bargaining chip to say, I'd be a really good fit for that. And then hopefully you have Yuki Tsunoda competing against Red Bull in a car built by Adrian Newey. There are two incredibly important things to remember about a sport like Formula One. One, it is a business, and a very, very expensive one. And two, every move that you're seeing when it comes to driver pairings, engine suppliers, sponsors moving, is a game of chess, not checkers. Everybody is trying to plan for years down the line. We have regulation changes coming, drivers who plan to retire, multiple rookies coming into the grid this year, and a very limited number of seats. Not to mention an 11th team entering the grid in 2026. There is so much possibility as to what's coming next, but one thing we can be pretty sure about is that the Red Bull Mercedes dynasty is coming to an end. And if we look at the data from this year and the changes that are being made next year, it is highly likely that the next dynasty pairing we're going to see is McLaren and Ferrari. Ironically, if you look at the dynasty cycle that was ended in 2009 when Braun won, Ferrari had been dominating. And if you look at the dynasty that Ferrari ended, McLaren and Williams were the previous dynasty. So as we move through this next dynastic cycle, the most obvious players on the board right now are McLaren and Ferrari. Ferrari is getting ready to inherit a 7-time world champion, and McLaren made their mark known this year. But when you look at Aston Martin, their future partnership with Honda, and the fact that they've gotten Adrian Newey, that's a team that does have the possibility to throw a wrench in that pairing. But as I said, once we got out of the facts, this was all just pretty much my opinion, and I'm curious how you feel. Do you think Red Bull can keep themselves from falling the same way Mercedes has? Or do you think both Red Bull and Mercedes are heading into a rebuilding phase and that we aren't going to see championships from them for a bit? Do you think that Ferrari and McLaren have what it takes to go toe-to-toe? And if so, which team do you think will come out on top? And last but not least, do you think a team like Aston Martin or another sleeper on the grid has the possibility to put their foot in the door and challenge either of these teams? I'd love to know what you think, so drop it in the comments below, and let me know if there's anything in this video that you want me to expand on. As always, I am always happy to answer questions about things you don't know about Formula 1 or other sports, and you can make sure that you don't miss a single one of those explainers by subscribing right now. And I will see you very soon, because the end of the Formula 1 season does not mean that I don't have anything left to say. Unfortunately, I have to yap, and it's gonna be your problem.